Hello and welcome to episode 166 of the Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Dave here in Chicago, and as you can hear, there's no Stan this week, at least not for right now. There's no Shane this week. He's on vacation. But who I do have joining us this week, fresh off a trip to the beautiful crossroads of America, is Dr. Michael Rapp, board-certified shadow scientist, joining us after competing in the SCG Con main event this weekend. Michael, what did you play this weekend in Indianapolis?
I played the modern seat, and I played Grixis Shadow.
What a surprise.
Yeah.
If you know Michael, you know that he's done extensive work on brewing, tweaking, and playing with Death Shadow in Modern. We wanted to bring him on this week to talk about the future of that deck in the format and the future of the format through the lens of one of the decks that's always there, and of course recently contributed to the banning of Lurrus. So we're going to go deep on Death Shadow this week and dig a little deeper into an article he just wrote for Card Kingdom last week titled "The Rumors of Death Shadow's Demise Have Greatly Exaggerated." So check that out on Card Kingdom's blog if you have a second. But before that, we will break down the results of this weekend's SCG Con in Indianapolis, which was a team, modern, pioneer, and legacy tournament. So before we get into that, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. It's everybody's favorite part. For new patrons, we wanted to thank Steve Bobivo for joining us in the Patreon. And for increased tiers, we had Aaron C., who joined us at an increased tier this week. Thank you very much for your support. And if you'd like to support The Dive Down, you can find us on patreon.com/The Dive Down, where as little as $1 a week will get you access to our definitively discreet Dive Down Discord server. You can come and talk to us, come and talk to the members of the community, and kind of go from there, where we're constantly talking about tournaments and everything you can imagine under the sun for Magic. And then if you'd like to support the Dive Down while playing Magic, check us out on manatraders.com. We've talked about it a million times over the years. You know, we've been using ManaTraders for 3+ years. If you want to check it out, you can sign up using code the Dive Down 2022 to get 15% off of your first 2 months of ManaTraders card rental service on Magic Online, manatraders.com. So with all that stuff out of the way, Michael, let's talk about Indianapolis.
Sure thing.
So you went there this weekend. Who was on your team?
So my team was, I usually actually have a pretty static team. Our legacy player is usually Tom Kessler. He won one of the Leaving Legacy Opens, I think 2 back, something like that. And our Pioneer player is usually Zach Turgeon, who is oddly enough known for Legacy Moonstompy. But he wasn't with us this time. So we had my buddy Marcus, and he played Jeskai Ascendancy, and Tom played 8-Cast.
8-Cast. In Legacy, what? So I'm not super familiar with Legacy. Let's talk. So I'm familiar with Jeskai Ascendancy. That's the deck that, you know, people have, I think, somewhat tapped as like a little bit of a boogeyman that's maybe on its way to being super good and annoying in Pioneer. It's kind of, I think, certainly we have occasional people who kind of go off in our Pioneer channel on our Discord server about how broken that deck is, but also, you know, sometimes pretty disruptible as well. Since we're talking about Pioneer for a second, have you played a lot of Pioneer, or do you pretty much stick to Modern these days?
I've actually been having a lot of fun with Pioneer. I played some of the black-red mid-range decks, be it the bigger versions with like Chandra Torture Defiance or Graveyard Trespasser, as well as the black-red blood decks before Lurrus got banned. But I've actually recently been having a lot of fun with Jund Sacrifice.
Oh, no kidding. Those are definitely decks that I've been wanting to look at in Pioneer too. We're kind of dipping our toes back into Pioneer in the past 6 months or so, especially after Historic. We were covering Historic for a while, and then Historic kind of got bad over the last year, honestly. And so people started saying, hey, Pioneer's great. Pioneer's, you know, a really good format. And so I've been having fun with it here and there, but that's awesome to hear. How did you guys end up on the Jeskai deck instead of something that's more kind of mid-rangey? Was it just player preference, or how did you guys circle on that one?
Marcus is like pretty solidly combo biased player. So he was going between Jeskai Ascendancy and Lotus Field, and he thought that Jeskai Ascendancy would be a little bit better against the creature decks that he thought was going to show up.
Oh, right. That makes a ton of sense. And then you said that Tom was on 8-Cast in Legacy. What does that deck list look like? I'm not even sure I'm familiar enough with Legacy to know that one by the name.
So it's actually the Kappa Cannoneer deck.
Oh, right. Okay.
or Blastoise as people call it. But it's your like Emery, Psy, Urza's Saga, Kappa Cannoneer, and then you have like 4 Thought Monitor, 4 Thought Cast to kind of just keep the cards coming. And then you have
Well,
a
so it
bunch
is
of
the same as modern. That's not the same as modern, but a similar idea to the deck that's called Acast in modern as well. I didn't realize.
yeah, and then you have a bunch of zeros like Mox Sopal, Urza's Bauble, Mishra's Bauble, Lotus Petal to kind of keep all of those things going to make sure all of your affinity cards are cheap and make sure you're getting enough tokens from Psy and putting enough counters on Kappa Cannoneer.
So I saw that you guys had a pretty good run. What was the weekend like for your team? Kind of day as it started out. I know that you guys started out 3-0, which is awesome. Kind of where did it go from there?
So we were 3-0, and then we lost a close round 4 to go to 3-1. Won round 5, lost round 6, and then won 7 and 8 to make day 2 at 6-2.
Congrats, by the way. I know that you're shooting for something higher than that, but day 2 I think is still an awesome thing to do.
Yeah. No, it was a good feeling to make day 2 for sure. And then in day 2, we had a really rough go of things in day 2. I think we went 2-3 in day 2.
Oh.
Yeah, things just like didn't really break our way. Couple of rough matchups on multiple ends of the table, to be honest.
Yeah.
But all in all, like I had a blast. Like team Magic is so much better than individual Magic, because Magic is great and friends are great, and getting to play Magic with your friends is great.
Yeah, I've only done team sealed before in a tournament, and I've never done team constructed. But team, it's so great to be able to just lean over to someone and be like, "Hey, this is the situation I'm in. Can we talk about it quickly?" Or to be able to talk with someone about sideboarding in between games, or to be able to just kind of like be with the same people all afternoon. Because that is one thing, like you said, about paper Magic tournaments or just Magic tournaments in general, is that if you get really deep into a big tournament like that, round 6, round 7, it can start to feel kind of isolated, where you're just kind of like, okay, well, I'm just kind of making it through the day, but I haven't seen my friends in a couple hours. I don't know where they are, but it's awesome to be with the same people all day. What place did you guys end up finishing, though? I mean, you still went 8-5, it sounds like, which is... Did you guys not finish? Decide not to complete all the rounds, or?
No, actually, there was only 13 rounds.
Oh, okay.
Which I also thought was weird because team tournaments that I've played in the past, team Grand Prix or whatever, have always had 14 rounds. So I was a little surprised by that. Yeah, I think we finished 8-5. I think we finished in 25th place, which all in all isn't the worst. But going into day 2 in the position that we were in, hoping for a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, maybe next time for sure. I don't know if there's any more team constructed tournaments coming up for SCG, but I know that there's some other paper ones coming up soon. Are you thinking about going to Dallas at all? I know we chatted about it a little bit on Twitter, but
I'm still considering it. I'm not 100% sold on it. I know I'm going to Pittsburgh, which is team sealed at the end of April, I think. I think it's the last week of April.
Well, if you do make it, I hope I get to meet you in person for the first time after we've done a couple episodes together. I know that you were on our compilation episode about Vegas as well, so that would be awesome for sure. And just a reminder to everybody listening, Shane and I are definitely going to be in Dallas. All things considered, we have our arrangement set up and everything. So if you want to hang out when you're in Dallas, let us know. Send us a tweet at the Dive Downs Twitter, and we can meet up sometime. So why don't we talk a little bit about the top 6, and then maybe we can talk about the way that the metagame looked, at least in modern, as we go from there. So first place was Clay Spickelmeyer, Andrew Ellenbogen, and Max McVitie on Is It Delver, 4-color Yorion, and 5-color Humans. What do you think of these 3 lists as far as choices within the metagame go? Of course, they won, so but these all seemed like pretty somewhat expected lists to me for the different formats, although I'm not as familiar with 5-color Humans in Pioneer. I'm certainly familiar with most of the cards that are in Humans from the modern version, and those decks are starting to converge a little bit to me.
Yeah, so I think Legacy Delver is kind of the baseline. It is like the de facto best deck, so I think a lot of high-level players, especially if they are, tempo or mid-range leaning, are going to show up with that deck. 4-color Yorion, especially after the Lurrus ban, also probably the best deck. Tons of decision points. So again, I think a deck that more high-level players are going to pick up and do well with. The only thing that strikes me as odd here is 5-color Humans. Coming into this tournament, I didn't expect it at all. I know Max leans on the aggressive side of things, so it makes sense that this is a deck that he would show up with. But he seemed to do well with it, and it worked out for them.
Yeah. So since people aren't as familiar with this, I'm just going to talk about the deck list on the 5-color humans really quickly. So it does have a lot of the cards that you would expect to be in here from Modern, although we're missing kind of like the powerful 1-drops that were in the Modern list before. So obviously there's nothing like Noble Hierarch and Pioneer. So this deck has Experiment 1 and Thraben Inspector. Experiment 1 is a pretty interesting card. That was a absolute house in the draft format from that back in the day, I remember, and also pretty good in construct in standard at the time as well. It's the 1/1 that has evolve, and so it's a 1/1 for 1, and it gets bigger whenever bigger creature comes into play, and then you can remove 2 1/1/1 counters from it to regenerate it, which is pretty good. And then Thraben Inspector, of course, it's a 1/2. It's a body that can be pumped by Thalia's Lieutenant and makes clue token so you can draw a card. Then the 2-drops are Werewolf Pack Leader, Thalia Guardian of Thraben, and Thalia's Lieutenant, and then a 2 of Kultida Dawnheart Prime, which is a 1/1 from Midnight Hunt. It has an activated ability that says human creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any of this creature's colors, and then it has another activated ability that's a 6 mana value and tap to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So it's another pump effect for your team. And then, of course, the 3-drops that we're familiar with, mostly from Modern, at this point in different eras in humans, there's Reflector Mage, Mantis Rider, a couple of General Kudro of Dranith, and a couple of Adeline Resplendent Cathar, and then the whole deck is topped off by Collected Company. So I think that the creatures all make a ton of sense in this particular deck, but it is surprising to me how close it's getting to a lot of the same cards that we saw in Modern for a long time. The big difference here for me is the addition of Secluded Courtyard to be able to use it for an activated ability or any color. It is that addition of the second 5-color humans, creature land that I think helps make a mana base like this a lot easier to construct.
Yeah, they have 8 rainbow lands now with Unclaimed Territory, Secluded Courtyard, and Mana Confluence, which certainly is going to help them cast their spells, especially when you have like a double green 2-drop and a white 2-drop into like a 3-color 3-drop or a double white 3-drop. Those mana requirements are pretty taxing. So having 8 having 11 instead of 8 rainbow lands is going to help that deck actually be able to cast its spells, which was always the biggest problem with it.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so they won the event, so congrats to them. In second place, we had Kyle Moran on Jeskai Control / Jeskai Days. We'll talk about that deck in a minute. Kevin Thanikit on Blue White Hammer and Jeffrey Silver on Phoenix. So in the Modern Pioneer seats, I think that these are kind of 2 other pretty well-established decks within the meta. I think Phoenix, a lot of people I think probably think is the best deck in Pioneer right now. So I don't know if we need to dive too deeply into that. Were you ever a Phoenix person? Or were you a person that hated Phoenix when it was in Modern and in Pioneer as well?
I went back and forth on Phoenix and Modern. I played it a little bit, but at that time I was still pretty big on Shadow. That was like right as I was starting to find a lot of success with Shadow.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't play a ton of Phoenix while it was around, but I do generally like that style of deck.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny how close the spell suite is to what you're trying to do with a deck like Shadow sometimes, right? With, certain incarnations of it where you have your cantrips and you have a lot of spells, you're kind of trying to chain things together. Different payoffs, but kind of sometimes a similar play style for sure. Tempo-ish, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I like about both decks is they have a lot of action economy. You're doing a lot of things which, if you can do enough things, it doesn't particularly matter how powerful they are because you just get more done than your opponent.
Yep. That's something that Stan and I have talked about a lot over the last couple of years, which is just like trying to find decks where you do more things than your opponent can make you, feel like you're having better outcomes, and often does. The Jeskai Days deck. So again, I'm gonna pick your brain a little bit here because I'm not super familiar with Legacy, but Stan actually mentioned this deck on our episode last week because we were talking about Days Undoing in a different context. And he said that it was a legit control package, part of a control package in Legacy. And I was kind of like, you got to be kidding me. And then I know there's 2 different players who took this deck to the top 6 here. Did you have to play against this deck at all this weekend? Is this a kind of recent addition to Legacy, or is this something that's been around for a minute?
So I don't particularly remember if we played against this deck this weekend, maybe once. But I know this deck popped up like a month and a half, 2 months ago. I think it won a Moto challenge or a Moto PTQ of some kind. And it's always kind of just stuck around ever since. And after the banning of Ragavan, it seems to be getting more popular.
So if you're not familiar with this list, listeners, it has the combo that people have tried out in Modern a few times with Narset, Parter of Veils, and Days of Undoing in the deck, where you basically make someone discard their hand and not be able to draw any more cards, and then you draw a fresh 7, essentially, which is pretty interesting. And then outside of that, it's kind of what you would imagine a blue-white control shell might be. It's got Force of Will, Force of Negation, Brainstorm, Ponder. It even has Dress Down. It has Prismatic Ending, Swords of Plowshares, and then you have Wandering Emperor and Teferi Time Raveler as other kind of planeswalkers within the deck. It's basically a planeswalker control kind of shell with that Days Undoing combo. In third place, we had James Wagner on Turtle Affinity, Martin Camo, Boros Burn, Andrew Sparger on Mono Red Aggro. And then in the other third, fourth place team, we had David Lance on Yorion Taxes and Legacy, which I was also surprised to see that Yorion was making a splash in Legacy as well. Modern, we had Josh Shields on Blue-White Urza Thopter with Moonsnare prototype, which is a pretty interesting card. And then on the Pioneer seat with this team, we had Eamon Abadi on Lotus Breach. Any thoughts about any of the deck selections here?
I think Lotus Breach is like totally reasonable. It keeps doing well online, but it hasn't translated. There haven't been paper Pioneer tournaments,
right,
really, of any actual size. So this is kind of like its breakout tournament in paper, I think. And given the results it's putting up online, I'm not surprised to see it here. I think that something we'll probably touch on a little bit later. I think that one of the best up-and-coming decks in Pioneer right now is Blue-White Control. And I think Hidden Strings actually has probably a positive Blue-White Control matchup, but it requires the Hidden Strings player to really know what's going on in the matchup, which, if you're somebody that is in the position to top 4 a tournament of this size, you probably know.
Why does Hidden Strings? So Hidden Strings is the cipher card that lets you tap or untap a target permanent, then you may tap or untap another target permanent. Why does this have a positive matchup? Is it just that Lotus has a positive matchup against Blue-White, or is it this card helps with that matchup for some reason that I'm kind of missing?
So I guess the key difference between Lotus Breach and something like Jeskai Ascendancy is the Blue-White control deck can't interact with Lotus Field, the card, which is your engine. But they can interact with Jeskai Ascendancy via counterspells and now March of the Otherworldly Light. So they kind of have multiple main deck disenchants, which is not great for them. But Lotus Breach is very good at seeing its entire deck, and it has 2 Fae of Wishes and a Mastermind's Acquisition to go get things from the sideboard, and it has Battlegat Recovery to help beat counterspells. So the Blue-White decks actually kind of have a lot of trouble if the Lotus Field deck gets to, 6 mana or 9 mana or whatever, and can wish for something like Thought Distortion.
Yeah, brutal.
Yeah, so once you can kind of set that up, then it's very easy to win from whatever spot that you end up in. And you don't particularly care if they counter your Hidden Strings or whatever, but you definitely care if they counter your Jeskai Ascendancy.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Interesting. Lotus Breach, it's funny. It's one of the only combo decks this style of, I don't want to say uninteractive combo, but big mana combo decks that I actually have because I bought the precon and have it ready to upgrade in case I ever play Pioneer, because it was such a nice package. Just be okay, there's 4 Lotus Field in this deck, I'm just going to buy it. So it'll be interesting to see as that, it's been popular in Pioneer for a long time. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if there are more paper Pioneer tournaments on the agenda coming up soon. What do you think about Urza in Modern right now? Speaking of the Josh Shields list that's on this team as well.
It's kind of in a weird place to me personally, because with 4-color being one of the best decks, Urza is particularly vulnerable to both Solitude and Fury. There's a lot of Dress Down running around in the format as well, which is good against Urza Saga Constructs, Stoneforge Mystic, Emry, and Urza. I think this will beat up on the non-blue mid-range decks, but I don't know how good those decks actually are right now.
You're talking like, when you say non-blue mid-range decks, you're talking like Jund, Rakdos, that kind of, just kind of normal, what we classically think of as mid-range and modern.
Yep. And I'm actually kind of surprised to not see Solitude in decks like this because they usually have them. But this deck is more artifact focused than I think a lot of these decks tend to be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool to see Moonsnare prototype in a top 8. It's, in one of the first tournaments, one of the first paper tournaments after Neon Dynasty came out. It's funny to me that that this deck is not. I guess you have so many more non-creature artifacts in here than you have creatures that you want to run it in such a. There's 4 of these and only 1 Springleaf Drum, and usually I've seen it closer to being 2 and 3 or something, or even 3 and 3 or 4 and 3 kind of ratio. So you make sure that you're getting that ramp going on earlier. But Moonsnare has been a pretty cool card to play around with.
Yeah, it also has the nice upside of a Springleaf Drum of not being a bad draw on turn 5.
Right, because of the channel ability.
Yep.
Yeah, it's funny. It's really easy to forget about stuff like that in Modern because because the casting cost essentially is so high, it's 5 to do it. But that's exactly what makes something like that good, is that it gives it some utility late in the game when you actually want to get rid of a problematic permanent or something like that.
And these Urza decks are rarely short on mana anyway.
True. Yeah. Absolutely. All right. And then the last 2 people to make the top 8, 5th and 6th place. So a friend of the show, Zach Allen, was in the legacy seat on Jeskai Day's list, similar to the one we talked about a moment ago. Ivan Espinoza in the modern seat on 4-color Yorion, and then Drake Sasser on Is It Phoenix and Pioneer. This is one that kind of feels to me like if Zach had been playing Delver instead, it would have been like, okay, the preeminent decks of each format basically on this team together. But it also sounds like you said earlier that Jeskai Day's deck is getting popular too, and of course Zach likes playing control, so no big surprise there. But I think these are all solid decks from good players in this 5th/6th place seat. And then finally we had Jimmy Brandline on Is It Delver, Joss Feliciano on 4-color Yorion in Modern, and then Jeremiah Kilby on Blue-White Control and Pioneer. Why don't we talk about Jeremiah's list for a second, since we were talking about Blue-White Control a moment ago? Why do you think this deck has a kind of an up arrow next to it in Pioneer right now? Is it just because of Wandering Emperor?
I think Wandering Emperor did a lot for that deck. I think March of the Otherworldly Light did even more for that deck.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Farewell's also here too.
Yep.
So they got some new stuff.
It's interesting. March of Otherworldly Light, I feel like people were kind of, since we mostly talk about Modern on the show, in the Modern context, people were kind of like, I don't know if it's good enough to displace Prismatic Ending. And guess what? It turns out people just run both in the decks that have space for it in some combination. And here in Pioneer, having that ability, like you said, to have a main deck disenchant that also functions as creature removal, that also functions as artifact removal if you want, has proven to be huge in Modern, of course. And then here in Pioneer, I'm sure it just makes a world of difference to decks like this. And frankly, probably any deck that wants to run white removal of one kind or another.
Yeah. Actually, the funny part is we played against this team twice in the tournament. And the blue-white player very easily beat our Jeskai Ascendancy player both times we played them. So that kind of highlights how that matchup goes archetypically for me.
Wow. I didn't realize that you could play the same team twice in the Swiss of a team tournament like this. Is it because the records just matched up and you kind of had to, or?
So honestly, I didn't either. But what happened was after day 1, they reset breakers. So that made it so that people could get paired against teams they'd already played against. And I've seen some discussion on Twitter where people are like, hey, why did this happen? Like, what was this a conscious decision to do this? Because it brings into account the question of the major concern that I've seen people bring up is tournament integrity when multiple teams end up playing each other multiple times.
Yeah. Did that happen to a lot of people?
I think that somebody said they played the same team 3 times over the course of the tournament.
No. What?
Twice in the Swiss and then 1 in the top 6.
Oh, jeez.
So that is, I think somebody said they played Andrew Ellenbogen's team 3 times, I think.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is a lot.
Huh. Yeah, that's very strange. Well, why don't we take a look at this meta list that was shared from MTG Melee as far as the decks that people took a look at in Modern, and then Maybe if we have time, I can dig up the one for Pioneer if you want to talk about it for a moment. But what did you think? How did the meta feel to you in the Modern seat while you were playing? Now, it's kind of a loaded question because I saw you talking on Twitter about the kind of strange matchups that you had happen. But how did Modern feel to you this weekend?
So overall, I think Modern is in a reasonable place. It's kind of sad because I thought even with Lurrus, Modern was, among the best that it had felt in a long time. So banning just Lurrus felt a little haphazardly decision to me, because once you ban Lurrus, everything flies out of whack, and the fact that either Yorion or Teferi is still legal is kind of confusing to me, because it seems like that is immediately where the metagame goes.
Yeah, I will say I was a little bit of a Yorion skeptic maybe right after Lurrus was banned. Not that I don't think the card is good, but there would be so much consolidation around the card kind of in the immediate aftermath of Lurrus being banned. And then last week we looked at every deck in a 5-0 drop and kind of categorized them and talked about everything. And I was shocked at how many decks were just people jamming Yorion into humans and into we saw a Yorion Titan list, and we saw all these like weird people just trying to exploit the next most powerful card that's left standing after Lurrus was gone.
Yeah, which I think is either Yorion or Teferi.
Yeah.
It's to the point where like Hammer Time is playing Teferi now, so like that's how that to me is a red flag.
Interesting. And personally, I noticed that you were in particular, it sounded like you drew a lot of matchups into Solitude Teferi decks. Is that right?
Yeah, I played against Blue-White Control 4 times. I played against 4-color Yorion 4 times, and I played against Jeskai Bloodsun twice.
Jeskai Bloodsun twice?
Right? That's what I said.
Oh my gosh.
So it's kind of funny because my opponents kept revealing Kahiras. I played against Amulet in round 1 and Burn in round 2, and then 7 blue-white variants in a row.
That's unbelievable.
And at one point, I think it was the third match in a row, my opponent had revealed Kahira. I looked at my teammates and I'm like, I think I've fallen into some sort of like alternate universe, so please pull on the rope, I need help. And we kept joking that it was going to be Belcher.
Yeah.
And at one point in the tournament, my opponent reveals Kahira. I think this is in round 12.
Right.
And I'm like, is it finally Belcher? I play a Ragavan on the play and pass to them, and they play whatever the back half of Valakut Exploration or Valakut Stoneforge is. And I was like, wow, it's finally Belcher. And I attack with my Ragavan, and they Solitude it. And I was like, this happened again?
And you're like, and you're playing Valakut Awakening, and you're...
Yeah, in your Cryptic Command deck.
That's unbelievable.
So that was an interesting experience to play twice in the same tournament, for sure.
One question I have for you, because you mentioned you kind of grouped together 4-color Yorion and blue-white as kind of all being blue-white variants. Do you essentially think that like the 4-color Yorion decks are essential? Because I always have a hard time kind of deciding if I think that deck is control or mid-range. You know what I mean? Because it's just so good at kind of doing some of the things that it does. And like, do you feel like that's much more in the control kind of space than it is anywhere else?
I think it depends on how those decks are built. There's some of those decks that are built with like Eladamri's Call and Eternal Witness and Ragavan. And I think those decks are more mid-range leaning, but there are some of them that are built with 6 or 7 copies of Prismatic Ending and March of the Otherworldly Light and 4 counter spells, and I think those decks are more control leaning.
Yep. Yeah, it's just kind of shading 2 different directions of a similar core. But it is still fascinating to me that, I don't want to be the person who says like you can buy success in Magic. In particular, I think that 4-color Yorion is really hard to play. Like, it's not a deck that I would pick up, but it is fascinating to me that one of the decks at the top of the metagame is literally like $1,900 in the best cards that are available in Modern in one deck. And it's even, gets to play 80 cards, gets to, quote unquote, because the companion, restriction is that. And so it's just every good card in one place all at once with all the good lands.
Yeah, and that's the thing that drives it is, you hear people every now and then talk about how fetch lands are a mistake, but they're probably too deeply ingrained into Modern to do anything about. And I think these 4-color decks really highlight that. And one of the things I was upset about when I saw stuff about New Capenna coming out is that they're finishing the Triome cycle.
I know. So you're in camp. We didn't need to finish the Triome cycle.
So I'm a little torn because I think that unfinished cycles are bad. I'm still waiting for the Rakdos version of Horizon Canopy.
Same. I thought those were going to be in Modern Horizons too, honestly, but then they weren't.
Yeah, but I think that every time they make it easier to play 5-color mana bases without any problem, Magic gets a little bit worse.
Yeah.
Because those decks have these huge power level because they like all the high card quality cards that they have. But traditionally, their hang-up is their mana. Like, sometimes they can't cast their spells. And I think 4-color Yorion is like an embodiment of that, where not only do they have these very powerful spells, but because they have all the mana fixing to make it work, and cards like Fury and Solitude are free, they don't even have to worry about their mana requirements nearly as much.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's talk about some of the other decks in Modern here. So the number one registered deck, it looks like to me, although, the MTG Melee labels aren't always the most reliable thing in the world, it looks like Boros Burn was the most registered deck this weekend. From what I could tell, there were 27 decks labeled as Boros Burn and then 6 labeled as Burn. So I'm going to say that was 33 decks that were registered as Boros. So are you surprised that that was the most registered deck, even in a world where we were expecting a lot of Yorion, a lot of Omnath to be floating around?
So I think that if you expect Yorion, 4-color Yorion to be good, Burn is a good place to be. So that Burn showing up in high numbers makes sense to me, because I think everyone thought that the clear place to go after the Lurrus ban was to one of the Omnath decks. And Burn traditionally has a pretty good matchup against Omnath.
That's so counterintuitive to me, just because it gains life so frequently. But I guess that the decks, these 4-color decks, can kind of dirtle a little bit if they're not, they're not. You can sometimes get under them. They are slow enough that you can get under them with Burn, I guess.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is they only have 4 Omnaths. And it's an 80-card deck, which kind of matters. You're slightly less likely to find an Omnath than in a 60-card deck. But Omnath is still a 4-mana spell. Burn can certainly just have you dead by then, or close enough to dead, or have a Skull Crack for when you try to gain life with Omnath.
Yeah, and it really only takes one skull. Like, people kind of think a lot of times, if I have a Skull Crack against Omnath, then they're just going to gain life again the next turn. But often preventing one of those triggers is usually enough for you to be able to kind of close out the game, because you're preventing 4 life, and you're also doing 3 more damage to someone at the same time.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time, if you Skull Crack the first Omnath trigger, they don't get the opportunity for a second one.
Yeah, you said that much better than I did. So from what it looks like to me, it kind of looks like the next most registered deck was Murktide, potentially. Now, I know that the screenshot list that we have doesn't have that, but there are 16 decks listed as Is It Tempo. There's 6 decks listed as Is It Aggro, and then there's 8 decks listed as Is It Mid-Range. And I gotta wonder, are those all Murktide decks, you think, or do you think that those are different from each other?
I saw a couple of Prowess decks floating around. I don't know how many there are.
Wow. Okay.
But I would guess that some of the Is It Aggro decks are Prowess, and probably most of them are Murktide.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the clear winners coming out of the Lurrus ban were Burn, 4-color Yorion, Murktide, and Amulet.
Yep. And look, there they are at the top of the metagame.
Yeah, so it makes sense that we're seeing a lot of those decks come out in pretty high numbers.
Yep. And speaking of, the next deck that is on the list is Amulet Titan. Now, I am starting to hear from people in our Discord, even the people who play Amulet, that they're like, Amulet's just super, they just think that Amulet's maybe the best deck right now. Now, of course, Titan players always think that. But, what do you think about that deck right now? You said it was a winner. Why do you think it's a particular winner with after the Lurrus ban?
I think the Grixis Shadow matchup for Amulet Titan was very bad. So now that deck at least is taking a step back in the short term, they don't have to worry nearly as much about things like Dress Down and Unholy Heat. They do have to worry about that out of Murktide, but you don't have Murktide and Shadow doing it.
Right. It's a much smaller portion of the metagame.
Yeah, exactly.
And people keep going at them with Blood Moon too, and it's a different ballgame now with Boseiju.
Boseiju and Dryad.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Dryad is always like, did it happen at the right time? But Boseiju is like, okay, we're just gonna win through a turn 3 moon way more often than you thought we were able to.
Yeah, and they're such a good Boseiju deck that it doesn't even really cost them anything to be able to have a clean answer to Blood Moon.
Absolutely. All right, let's just talk about a couple of last decks on here. So we talked about Yorion already. We think that that's really close to the top of the list. That was probably around 25 decks registered, so that was kind of next on the list. Grixis Shadow was actually 5th, it looks like, here, with 16 decks registered out of the teams, which is kind of like clearly the next tier down, but it's not that far behind the other decks that were all in the kind of mid 20s to 30 registers. Any other lists surprise you from what you've seen? For me, I guess one thing I would say is not very many people registered Hammer this weekend. I still am a little bit surprised by how few people are playing Hammer at this point in time. And maybe it's just it is farther out of step with the meta than I thought. What kind of things surprised you from this list or from what you saw?
So I actually think that there are slightly more 4-color Yorion than we think, because I think a lot of those 4-color control decks are probably your 4-color Yorion decks, putting it at like 31.
Yep.
But yeah, I was surprised that very few people showed up with Hammer. And I think there was less of the Cascade decks than I thought there was going to be.
Yeah. The only reason that I to go back to the Yorion note, one thing, I did notice that some 4-color control decks were actually creativity lists when I was looking through things. So that's why I was kind of like, it's maybe not quite as high, but either way, one thing is, I was surprised to see 4, 5, maybe 6 people register creativity right now, which I think is a deck that is getting more popular. Whether it's good or not, I don't know. I've had a lot of trouble, as I've talked about on the show a couple times. I've had a lot of trouble playing it. But yeah, I thought that was one thing that was interesting too. I now that you mention it, I'm really surprised that there wasn't more Living End either, because I do think there's a bit of an up arrow next to Living End in particular out of the Cascade decks right now.
Yeah, I think Living End was a big winner out of the Lurrus ban. I think Cascade decks in general are, but I think Living End is the most. Those decks also had very rough time against Grixis Shadow. They are just exactly the kind of decks that Shadow wants to play against. And on top of that, I think Living End is very good against 4-color Yorion and Amulet Titan.
Yep. And actually, Stan, who's just joined us, who's going to pop in a little bit. Hey, Stan, how are you?
Oh, hey, guys. I didn't know you were recording tonight. I wish someone had told me. I had to see the tweet.
Yeah, sorry. We were trying to just, have one without you for once, but just trying it out. What I was going to say was Stan's been playing Living End a little bit lately and actually has found that the matchup against Burn is really good too, because it just tends to not really be fast enough to stop you from what you're doing, and it can't interact with kind of the combo at all, basically. So I do think it's pretty well positioned against a number of the decks that are at the top of the list there. What do you think about that matchup, Michael? Do you think that do you have any thoughts about Burn versus Living End?
I think Living End is reasonably well set up to beat Burn, especially because they have 4 main deck Force of Negation, which certainly, I think those decks operate on a similar speed. Because Living End wants to go off on turn 3, Burn's trying to kill you somewhere in the realm of like turn 3.5 or so. But I think Force of Negation kind of tilts that towards Living End.
I think it also helps that none of your cantrips are dealing Eidolon damage to you, and you can sometimes play your mana slowly enough that you're barely doing any damage off the off your mana base. And then the other one, in addition to Force of Negation, the other great free spell is Grief, or Grief will sometimes just save you 4 life because you can pick off a Borrow Storm.
That is also a good point.
Michael, I'm curious about one thing I heard you say as I was coming in, is that GDS loved playing against some of these decks. Is it just because the hand disruption, Thoughtseize, Kroxa was just like really good at getting rid of combo pieces, or was there something else going on that you felt favored the Grixis deck in that matchup?
So I think in general against the Cascade decks, especially Rhinos and Living End that get to play main deck Force of Negation, decks like Murktide have a good matchup, but not as good a matchup, because I think that matchup is a lot about turns 1 to 3 action economy. So having to hold up actual Counterspell or Archmage's Charm or whatever can really get you bottlenecked going into the Living End turn or the Crashing Footfalls turn because of Force of Negation. But being able to deploy early disruption in the form of Inquisition and Thoughtseize and then back it up with Counterspells makes it harder for these Cascade decks to defend their combo piece.
So last thing before we hop over to talk in depth about Shadow, just would love to hear a little bit about how you all prepare as a team for a team tournament. Like, what are you thinking? How do you and your team kind of work out who's going to do what? Is there a certain kind of prep that goes into this tournament that's different than a solo one?
There could be for other teams. For us, not particularly. My group of friends in my testing team all kind of function in a way that we are all working on things together all the time anyway. So we'll be in Discord, multiple nights a week, and people will just be playing Moto Leagues, and everyone will be watching and providing input about plays or deck decisions or how to build a deck. So we're maybe more aligned with what you would think people do to prepare for team tournaments as a baseline. So we don't really change a whole lot in that kind of preparation. We do have, slightly more focused conversations about what decks each of us are thinking of playing or what decks we think are good, and then how to tune things for an expected metagame. But realistically, if I'm teaming with somebody, I trust them as a player and I trust them as a person. So whatever they feel they are going to show up with to give them the best chance to win, I am okay with whatever they bring.
Wow, Stan, I think I just realized what we don't have to make us a successful team in team tournaments.
No trust.
No trust, buddy. Where have you been? No, that's fine. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for going through that deep dive on Indy with us, Michael. We are going to take a little break here, and then we're going to come right back and talk in depth about Shadow, where it is, where it's going, where it's been, with one of the masters of the archetypes and someone who puts in all the work. So please stay with us. Hello.
David, it's me, Stanislav.
Stan, I knew it was you.
I'm calling you from the shower.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
What future are you from where you can have a phone in the shower?
My phone is wrapped in cellophane.
So we have talked about this a little bit, but I do have a hot tub now. And I legitimately bought waterproof cases for my phone and my iPad so I can hang out in the hot tub with my phone and iPad.
I lied about the cellophane. I'm just using your cases.
But you know what's great after you have a nice soak in the hot tub? Moisturizing with a nice product.
Such as
our wonderful sponsor, Barrister and Mann, who we love and adore and wanted to talk about a little bit right now.
I think more important than moisturizing is taking a shower to wash off the chlorine and all the other chemicals, because your skin does dry out and you smell weird sometimes. I mean, I kind of like the smell of chlorine, but you got to take care of your body. And I've been using a new Barrister and Mann soap.
Which one have you been using?
I've been using a bar of Castile soap.
You know what? It's funny. I've actually been using it too. I kind of switched it out.
Dude, isn't it fantastic?
Yes, it is. I've been using for a long time, I've been using kind of like the no scented, sensitive skin kind of stuff. And the bar that I got from Will at Barrister and Mann, doing the same job, feels better. Skin feels better afterwards. It's a more kind of pleasant experience than the kind of goopy microbead stuff that I was using before.
Dude, like the fact that it's fragranceless was really important to me. And a lot of times, like I'm in this routine where I've been using the same soap for 20 years, and then I'll, end up at someone's house and I have to take a shower at my friend's house after a barbecue because I'm covered in barbecue sauce, or like I'm at a hotel and I'm using like those
barbecue sauce,
barbecue sauce scented little sample sizes, and then like you feel kind of like oily and weird, and like your skin is like, why are you doing this to me? The Castile soap, it was just really gentle, didn't have any issues whatsoever, and this was like my first time just using a bar of soap on my body in I don't know how long. I've always just been a loofah and some Dove liquid soap person. And it was just like, the thing about the Castile soap I really liked is it has these like parts and pieces in it, like these little textures that actually make me feel like my body's getting a little bit of like exfoliation along with the cleaning and the lather.
Yep. Same thing. It's so funny that we use the same one. Not planned at all.
Not planned at all.
If you would like to check out Barrister and Mann, do us a favor, check them out and use the code DiveDown 2022. You can get a discount on your first order. How much is that discount, Stan?
It's 15%.
15%.
1.5.
Amazing.
It's so
Thank
good.
you so much, Barrister and Mann, for your ongoing support.
And thank you for letting me use this waterproof phone case for my shower, Dave. I'm going to go clean my body now.
You know what? I keep it.
All right, everyone, we are back. And, Michael, this is your third appearance, technically. You first did a bonus where Dave vetted you to make sure that you weren't catfishing us on Twitter. Then I met you in person in Vegas, and you were part of our Vegas episode, and it was really great chatting with you then. All these times you come onto the show to talk about Death Shadow. On Twitter, you're known as the Shadow Scientist. You won GP Toronto a few years ago playing Shadow. What is it about Death Shadow and you? We'd love to hear about your relationship with the card, the archetype, and really where it all started and how you got to where you are today, a 3-time dive down guest.
So first things first, thank you so much for having me back and on previously. It's been great to talk to you guys and everybody else.
You're far too kind. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah.
Oh, no problem at all. So I've been playing Shadow for probably the better part of the last 5 years. I kind of picked it up in 2018, 2017-ish when it was getting really big. What attracted me to that deck was I've always been kind of a tempo player, mid-range tempo, and I think Shadow fits into that mold very well. But I think that you just have these originally with Gurmag Angler and Stubborn Denial, you had these play patterns that were both efficient and very powerful. Like turn 2 Gurmag Angler with Stubborn Denial backup was very hard for most decks in the format to beat. So you kind of had the ability to be explosive with those starts, but also grind with Snapcaster Mage and Kolaghan's Command. So you kind of felt like you had game against everything, and that is something that I look for in when I select my decks. I also felt like I was playing a Legacy deck in Modern for a long time because all of your spells are so cheap and you're doing so many things in the early turns of the game compared to your opponents. So that was another thing that really hooked me when I started playing the deck. And
this is that action economy thing you were talking about a little bit earlier that you mentioned it about another deck that we were talking about too. Is that you really feel like that's something that helps you kind of in the way that you think about playing Magic?
Yeah, action economy is big, but also agency is really important. I don't tend to play a lot of decks like Burn, where you kind of just draw your card and play your card. And there's not a lot of there's not a lot of deviation from the cards that you draw off the top of your deck, right? Obviously there's nuances to Burn, when to hold your cards, how to sequence them or whatever. But cards that have multiple uses in multiple situations are always more interesting to me. And I think that Shadow tends to have a lot of those cards. Like right now, Drown in the Loch is one of my favorite cards by a design standpoint, because it took 2 classical like tempo control cards, Counterspell and Terminate, and kind of blended them together in a way that fixes the problem of both of them. Terminate is good when Counterspell isn't. Counterspell is good when Terminate isn't.
Yeah.
So it's cards like that that really draw me in. But also the games are like really interesting because of how you have to manage your life total. Like very few games play out the same way because you have to like gauge your opponent's level of aggression, and you kind of do this dance where like how much can you deal damage to yourself versus how much you have to let your opponent deal damage to you. And I find that really interesting.
So you said you've been working on the deck. You've been playing the deck basically for 5 years now. I will say I don't remember seeing a tweet from you where you've ever played anything else in Modern. Do you really play basically Shadow all the time? Is there deviations that you do? Like how much percentage wise do you think you are playing some version of a Shadow deck in Modern?
Depends what level of tournament we're talking about. I'll play other stuff at like, my LGS's weekly Modern nights or whatever. I'll play Murktide or Jund Saga or, something along those lines. And I try out a bunch of different decks on Moto, playing them through leagues. But if I'm playing in anything that matters, it's probably 90+% Shadow.
That's awesome. I mean, it's incredible dedication. And I think it shows. And being someone who's a fan of the deck, and I go through different eras where I like playing it, or I'm like, I'm going to get good at Shadow. I'm going to put the time in now. But you're always the first person I go to see what's going on now and to see kind of what you're thinking about in a given metagame or when a new set comes out and those kind of things. So I appreciate you kind of putting that effort into sharing that with everybody. And one thing that we're going to talk about a lot this particular episode, or refer to a few times, is an article you just published on Card Kingdom's blog, which we talked about earlier about, the rumors of Death Shadow's demise being greatly exaggerated. I would really just want to encourage anybody who's listening here to, follow Michael on Twitter, check out his articles on Card Kingdom. You do write articles about a number of different subjects on there, but you're always there with the latest version of Shadow right after there's a shift in the metagame. And so that's awesome to see in addition to the other stuff.
I have to imagine as well that when Shadow is as popular as it just was at the very least, when you're playing other decks, it's probably also helping you understand the format from other perspectives to, in some capacity, help improve your Shadow play too, and your understanding of Shadow in various matchups.
Yeah, I think it is important to play both sides of a matchup to effectively learn the matchup. So if I just literally only played Shadow all the time, I would never pick up on nuances that my opponent might be thinking about, and I would probably often fall into my own heuristics, which may not always be correct about the matchup. So playing it from both sides kind of helps weed those things out, which is certainly productive.
Awesome. So let's talk about what just was. I did, since I haven't talked to you in a little bit, I would love to hear a little bit about what you thought about the Lurrus Era of Shadow, kind of all in. Like, every deck, a lot of decks got really powerful from Lurrus or had powerful game plans kind of grafted onto the side of them. How do you think this latest version of Shadow, which a lot of people thought was the best deck in the format towards the end of that Lurrus Modern, how do you think that compared to other eras of Shadow? And why do you think Shadow maybe used Lurrus better than other decks did? Two separate questions, I guess.
Okay. So I think that if you're looking for a comparison on the power level of Lurrus Shadow given to previous Shadow decks, I think it is roughly around the 2018-ish era, where Shadow... That was the other time where Shadow is very close to, if not the best deck in the format.
Yeah, you mean when LSV was calling for Shadow to be banned?
Yeah.
Is that when
exactly.
that was in 2018?
I think that the Lurrus version is probably on a similar power level to that relative to the rest of the format. I think the Lurrus version is better than that deck in a vacuum, just because so many good cards have been printed in the last 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to follow up on the second question,
what? Yeah, I was asking. So, what do you think was so? Why was Shadow so good at leveraging Lurrus in a way that other lots of decks used it, but what was so good about the way that Shadow used it?
Lurrus added a second dimension to the Shadow deck, which is why it was so good. The Shadow core is very good at playing an aggressively slanted tempo style game, but Lurrus allowed you to take the control role in a number of matchups, specifically Hammer Time. Because Lurrus would let you just loop things like Dress Down and Engineer Explosives, and you could play things really slowly because Lurrus gave you that inevitability engine that a lot of those decks couldn't beat. Death Shadow, I think, was the most impacted deck losing Lurrus, because Lurrus gave you a lot of resilience at a very low cost. So now, I think where Shadow is post-Lurrus is the deck needs to answer a question, and it is, how do we compensate for losing that kind of resilience? And I think the answers are, you either have to go faster or find a way to go bigger. I don't know that Shadow can get a whole lot faster at the moment, especially not Grixis. I think that you could build a Jund Shadow deck that can go very fast with Become Immense Teamer Battle Rage. I don't think that deck can ever beat Solitude. So that's kind of a point against that deck, and a large point given how things looked this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that led me into trying to figure out how to go bigger, and Shadow does not excel very well at going bigger because it needs all of its cards to be so efficient and so cheap to get away with being able to play as few lands as it does.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. I love that idea of it has to adapt, and the two ways that it can adapt is faster or bigger.
Do you agree with the premise, though, that pre-ban Shadow was the best deck in the format? It felt like the discourse was often going back between Shadow and Hammer, and sometimes Murktide, even Amulet occasionally.
I think, in my opinion, the three best decks before the Lurrus ban were 4-color, Hammer, and Shadow. And I think you could make a strong case for any of them. I don't think that any of them were empirically better than the rest of them. Shadow was certainly getting hot as people figured out how to build the deck. There was very little variation in lists for the last 3 or 4 weeks before Lurrus got banned. So as the community honed in on finding the quote correct version of the deck, the results started to follow, and you saw Shadow putting up 2, 3, 4 top 8s on Moto challenges every weekend.
Or for the top 4 of an entire challenge that was all Grixis Shadow that one time. I think that was the one that Corey Baumeister was in the top 4 of.
Yep. Yeah, that certainly happened. And honestly, I think that was the
nail.
Yeah, I think that was the nail for Lurrus.
Yeah. I mean, even him, I think going on Twitter contributed to it and being like, hey, I've been loving playing this deck, but we can't do this anymore was pretty interesting to see.
And then likewise, do you think that Lurrus was kind of the thing that made the shadow decks less exploitable? That the meta had kind of gotten into this cycle where it was hammer 4-color shadow over and over and over, and because they had access to such a powerful companion that made both the deck more streamlined and more cheaper, but also more grindy and recursive as a result of just some of the tools that people used to rely on dealing with the shadow problem, if and when there was one, just weren't as consistent anymore?
Yeah, so I may have a kind of a skewed view on the subject as somebody that likes to play removal spells, but I've heard a lot of complaints over the years about Death Shadow. Luis was calling for it to get banned, and I've heard a lot of the similar complaints about Tarmogoyf. At the end of the day, these are just vanilla creatures. Like, if you're losing to vanilla creatures, put a removal spell in your deck, or kill them before it matters. Those are like two totally reasonable ways to go about dealing with things like Death Shadow or Tarmogoyf or whatever big body is attacking. So Lurrus insulated you from that. The Terminate strategy didn't really work as well because eventually they would just play Lurrus, pick Shadow, and then you'd need to find 2 more removal spells.
Right.
And getting that at little cost, I'm not going to say no cost because I'm sure there's cards that Shadow may have played had they had the opportunity over the course of time. But none of them were even as close to good as Lurrus.
And we're about to find out what some of those cards people might play without Lurrus because that's the world we're in now, right? And so, like you said, you've been working on getting Lurrus or getting this post-Lurrus version of Shadow together. Clearly, given the number of people that registered it for in Indianapolis, there are enough people who believe that the deck is still good enough to play. It's still viable. Why don't we talk a little bit about what we saw kind of in the first weekend afterwards? So one thing that I wanted to talk about quickly is we had a listener, before we get into your article, Michael, we had a listener, Water Cave, from our Discord, who put together a spreadsheet that shows all of the different Grixis Shadow decks that were registered at the Hunter Burton Memorial Open 2 weeks ago now. And I thought this was super interesting because it was basically 20 or so people that brought that. And Water Cave charted out a couple of different things that were going on in these different lists. And so what kind of emerged was, in notable cards that people were trying in Grixis Death Shadow, the first kind of list that was the highest was Street Wraith, Murktide Regent, and Gigantha. And then below that were kind of spicier things like Kaido Shizuki, the Royal Scions, even some Angler and Tassigurs, Dark Confidant, Snapcaster Mage. Some of the things that were really interesting here is that 75% of the Grixis Death Shadow decks in that particular event were people trying Street Wraith, kind of an average of around 2.5 copies, but that's kind of brought down by the fact that there were 5 decks that just didn't play it. So most of them were 4-ofs with a couple 3-ofs.
Couple 2-ofs even.
Couple 2-ofs, which is even more kind of perplexing to me. People running Croxa still, of course, and mostly as a 2-of, but we've definitely seen a lot of people running it as a 1-of. And then the biggest surprise to me from this particular first event is that not many people actually, a lot of people played Street Wraith, but not that many people played Murktide, which actually feels like those are the things that we thought were going to go together in this first version from there. I know you have a lot of thoughts about this. You've done a lot of work with all these different cards right now. I would love to talk for a minute about, I don't want to bring things up too quickly, but why don't we talk about Street Wraith for a second? Because I know it was probably one of the first things on your list to try, Michael. What kind of happened with that card in your mind, and where do you think that's positioned right now?
So, as a quick overview, when Lurrus got banned, my mind went to 3 places immediately. They were Street Wraith, Murktide, and Ranger Captain of Eos. And I think that Street Wraith combines with both of the other 2, at least in theory, very well. Street Wraith, I put into a Mardu version, a Murktide version, and something that resembled the Lurrus lists without Lurrus.
Yeah, and that's basically, just to say, this is what Michael documented really well in the article on Card Kingdom that we mentioned. And I do think that these are kind of the 3 main deck lists that we're going to talk about for the rest of the episode, right? We're going to talk about something that's close to the Lurrus list that we had before. We're going to talk about something that's got Murktide a little bit, and we're going to talk about Mardu Death Shadow a little bit as well. But go ahead, Michael.
So to touch specifically on Street Wraith, I'll talk about what I ended up calling it was the quotes stock GDS, because it was just the stock Lurrus list that I shoved some Street Wraiths in. just to see how that card would perform. And it was not as well as I had hoped. In short, you don't need to turbo out a Death Shadow anymore because the rest of your deck is more powerful. You don't need to rely on having an early Death Shadow or an early Gurmag Angler to be able to close the game, because Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Chandler do a great job at that anyway. So
that is one thing I wanted to ask you about. Those threats are such a fundamental change to Modern, but also to this list in particular. Do you feel like generally this version of the world of Grixis Death Shadow that we live in right now, it's a lot more aggressive than it used to be thanks to those 1-drops, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is more aggressive, less explosive, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense because it's more consistent. That was certainly one thing that I struggled with sometimes playing Death Shadow decks before, where your main threats were Gurmag Angler and and Shadow itself, is trying to really be much more thoughtful and careful about when you're bringing your threats out, because there are some things that you're not going to play a Shadow on turn 1, right? But now you have 8 cards in your deck that you really do want to play on turn 1, and I do think that's a little bit of a change from where Death Shadow was historically.
Yeah, so I think Street Wraith was good before, because the removal in Modern was not nearly as good. So if you put a Death Shadow on the table on turn 2 or 3, and it was a 3/3 or a 4/4 or a 5/5, you were like pretty likely to win the game, especially if you had a Stubborn Denial to back it up. But that's just not true anymore. Because of Prismatic Ending and March of the Otherworldly Light and Unholy Heat, it's so much easier to answer a turn 2, turn 3, 5/5. So you do a lot of work to get your life total down using Street Wraith and Thoughtseize and, the damage from your lands, and then your opponent just kills it. And then you're left without pressure and down a bunch of life.
Right.
So I think succinctly the answer to why Street Wraith didn't work out is there are just too many good cards now.
And you don't need the extra air. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, and there are too many good cards, not only in Shadow, but in the format at large.
And for that reason, playing chicken with your life total is just more of a liability than ever before?
Yeah, now it's funny because it used to be more of a sprint than it is now. Now it's kind of like an obstacle course. Because you don't need to get something on the table ASAP. Because you have the red 1-drops to do that.
Right.
So
that's awesome.
Now Shadow is kind of a closer instead of like your primary threat.
So I do think that's the one card that kind of touches on all the different archetypes. I think we'll double back on Murktide and Ranger Captain in a little bit. But while we're here, why don't we talk a little bit more about the kind of list that you've called the stock GDS list, and kind of get into what's going on with the build that you had lately. So, this is the deck that in your article you concluded was the best one. It's also basically the deck that you registered for Indy this weekend. Do you still feel like this is the version that you like the best right now, or maybe just kind of top level? Do you still feel like you favor this one?
Yeah. I registered. The list for my article is the list that I played in a Moto PTQ the weekend before. And it is also the same 75 that I played in Indy.
So let's talk about what was in this that stood out to me, and then love to hear if there's anything that I missed as far as really interesting kind of twist that you put on this particular version. The first card I wanted to talk about in this, though, is a card that I think some people thought was a meme in Death Shadow, but I think Stan and I were both kind of like not sure that this is a meme.
Yeah,
and that's Gigantha.
So I thought it was a meme.
Right.
A couple of the other Shadow guys that I work with, Ben Jones and some of the other guys, also thought it was a meme. I remember talking to Ben shortly after the Shadow ban. I'm like, some people are playing Gigantha, and he goes, that has to be a meme, right? I'm like, I think so. I was like, I'm going to try it, but I don't expect it to be great. But honestly, Gigantha has far and away exceeded expectations.
Can we talk about how and why? I saw you said that it won you a few games in particular, I think was the phrase I saw on your Twitter. Is it just having access to that extra card essentially for the late game, for what is the late game in Shadow, right? Getting to 5 mana is kind of the late game in a deck that only has 18 or 19 lands.
Or is it the fact that it's a 5 mana dork and you finally get to cast white and green spells.
Right.
Both, actually. There are a few games where I won because it was a 5-mana 5/5 when everybody was out of stuff. Because that's still just going to close the game relatively quickly if nobody has any resources. But I've actually won a couple of games through Blood Moon with Gigantha.
No way. That's amazing.
Yeah, I had a game on Moto like a week ago now, probably, where my opponent had a Blood Moon. I played my Gigantha, and on the following turn, I tapped it for mana and got to cast an Expressive Iteration and a Death Shadow.
That's so great.
And that is the scientific method.
Yeah, it's just like, honestly, I was going to try it just because Gigantha kind of highlights how good the companion mechanic is.
This is what I was just going to ask you, Michael, is that's all that feels like to me, too.
Yeah, because like Lurrus in a Death Shadow deck makes a ton of sense. It pays you off for what you already want to be doing. It's outwardly very powerful. Gigantha just like looks mopey. It's like not on plan, but just having an 8th card matters so much in a lot of prolonged games in Modern, which is kind of where Shadow needed the help. You know, I mentioned earlier that you had to find a way to go bigger, and Gigantha is one of the easier ways to go bigger.
It's true. I mean, I personally kind of wish that they had banned all the companions. Like I'm not to open this can of worms because we have other things to talk about today, but this is the type of thing that makes me continue to feel like that's probably the only outcome that makes sense eventually here, because people are just going to put 8th cards in their decks as often as they can put 8th cards in their opening hands. You know, that's just what it is. But yeah, it's one of the most powerful mechanics ever printed, and this is more evidence of that. I think is totally true.
Truthfully, I would have played Obosh. That is like much more on plan than Gigantha is, but Expressive Iteration is too good to give up.
Yeah, there's just no way there for sure. And I'm a huge Obosh fan, and we can talk about that in a little bit because it has made an appearance in Mardu Death Shadow lists of certain constructions. So we could chat about that a little bit towards the end here. Let's talk about the Planeswalkers, though. I know that there's been a lot of interest in trying to figure out if there is a good Planeswalkers that's in here. I remember a few years back when the Royal Science first came out, you were playing with that. I think you and I talked about it a little bit on the bonus episode that we did about Shadow at the time. But lately you've been playing with Kaito Shizuki, which is a card that is surprisingly similar to Royal Science, right? And I think you mentioned that in your article as well. Can you talk a little bit about the role of a Planeswalker in this deck, which we didn't really have space for before?
Yeah, it's another one of those things where I looked at it and I go, how do we go bigger? We need a recurring source of cards. Because as we get later into the game, our more efficient cards stop mattering as much. And that gives way to our opponent's more powerful, more expensive cards. So if we're going to beat those more powerful, more expensive cards, we need to have more efficient cards. So we need to be generating value over the course of multiple turns. So one thing that I looked at was playing more Croxes, right? But I think the blue-white and the 4-color decks generate so many cards that discarding one to Croxa every turn is not a huge deal. Also, it's weak to Solitude. Also, it's weak to Rest in Peace, which a lot of those bigger decks have access to. So that wasn't going to work. And then I was like, well, what can we do then? And as these decks move toward more of a balance of March of the Otherworldly Light and Prismatic Ending rather than being Prismatic Ending dominated, that starts to favor Planeswalkers a little bit. Because the key difference between those cards, even though they look very similar, is March can't hit Planeswalkers.
Right.
So I went, well, what Planeswalkers can I reasonably play? And because of Gigantha, I couldn't play Jace, which was originally a card that I had in my sideboard for those matchups. So
wait, Jace,
the Mind Sculptor,
like the Mind Sculptor?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
The Solitude decks really struggle to beat that card. So Fury is actually not super good against Shadow post board, so I think a lot of those decks tend to cut those, or at least trim on them. I'm also boarding up to 4 dress downs in that matchup too. And if you're concerned about Fury, you can just plus Jace on the first turn. So there's enough ways to mitigate Fury as an answer to Jace.
But I can't believe the world that you're telling us we live in here for a second. Just as an aside, that the benefits of Gigantha outweighs the benefits of having Jace the Mind Sculptor in your sideboard. What do you think Patrick Chapin would think about that?
You would probably be very upset with me.
That's funny.
But, I mean, when it comes down to it, Giganta theoretically affects all of your matchups. Jace just doesn't. So at the end of the day, I think having access to Giganta is probably more important than having access to the one Jace that was in my sideboard.
Yeah.
But that led me down to the Planeswalkers that I was considering, which are the Royal Scions and Kaido. I also considered Spyro, Seasoned Pyromancer, but again, because of Giganta, you can't play that.
Right.
And when you look at those cards, like you said, they look very similar, and they kind of are. They both loot. Kaido draws a card sometimes. The Royal Scion's second +1 to give +2/+0 for a second trample is more in line with Shadow's plan.
Especially with if you have a monkey on the board, that seems like a great target for the second plus on Scions.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, the only creature in the deck that isn't like very good with Royal Scion's combat-related ability is Dragon's Rage Channeler. Because like Croxa and Death Shadow are big enough that having Trample is very good. Giving Ragavan First Strike lets it attack into a lot of stuff. And even trample over things to get its trigger.
Yep.
But in a lot of those matchups against like the Solitude decks and the other grindy decks, you can't guarantee that you're going to have a creature in play when you're playing this Planeswalker, because so many of them are so loaded with interaction. So when I looked at it, I came to the conclusion that the Royal Scions is better when you have stuff already, and Kaido is better when neither player has stuff. Just because Kaido has this play pattern where if nobody has anything, you play it, you make a 1/1, and then Kaido phases out, so they can't deal with it that turn, or at least it's hard for them to deal with it that turn. And then you just have a personal Howling Mine going forward. So in a game of very low resources, having a personal Howling Mine is very strong compared to only being able to loot every turn.
Yeah. I was wondering if that was the difference, and how do you feel like that exact scenario comes up a lot, where you're kind of like Kaido's the last card that you play, where it's the end of, after everybody's traded all their resources, and you're like, all right, this is how I'm restarting the second phase of this game, basically.
Yeah, that comes up in like the Shadow Mirrors all the time. Honestly, I played on turn 3 against 4-color and blue-white reasonably often, because you can play like a turn 1 creature, whether it's Dragon's Rage Channeler or Ragavan, and they almost always have to kill it on the spot. Mm-hmm. There's a few times where they didn't kill my Ragavan right away, and I just got to play Kaido on turn 2 and just start drawing cards every turn.
Yeah.
Whoa. That's a nightmare. Right, because then you're getting their cards and you're getting your card.
Yeah, you just like run away with the game very quickly in those scenarios.
And your opponents are probably going to assume that Ragavan is the problem there, but really it's the fact that you have a 3-mana walker that just buries your opponent in card advantage, essentially.
Yeah, and they have to deal with it eventually. Like the ultimate on Kaido is not super impressive, but it's not nothing. Eventually, it's just going to start putting Death Shadows into play over and over, which
is hilarious.
It's going to be a problem for them.
Yeah. Have you done that? Have you ulted that where it mattered before?
I've been able to, but I haven't. Like I had a Kaido on like 8 or 9 this weekend against 4-color. But it was better to just keep drawing cards.
We've talked about 4-color a lot. You've brought up Solitude a number of times. I just want to take a very quick aside. Is Solitude lights out against Death Shadow, just not only because it's a removal spell, but it also gains you a ton of life? Or do your cheaper threats and some of your alternative cards kind of help solve that problem? Or is that where Dress Down becomes really critical too?
So that Dress Down helps in that scenario quite a lot. And I think that is part of the reason why towards the end of the time period that Lurrus was legal, that Shadow was considered the best deck and not Murktide. Because Shadow got to leverage Dress Down so much more effectively because it played on plan instead of just being a card that you had to play in your deck to deal with Solitude. I think Solitude is lights out if you don't respect it, which is why you have to have, a number of discard spells and a number of Dress Downs. And one other card that I think is incredibly important right now is Torok Dreadcantor.
Yeah, that was the next card on my list, actually. So let's talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah, so going into the weekend before Indianapolis, when I played in the Moto Super PTQ, I knew that I wanted 4 copies of Dress Down and 3 Toroks in my 75. Because, as we talked about earlier, I think it is reasonable for many people to move to 4-color after the Lurrus ban, because that was one of the big winners without Lurrus. Because nothing in that deck got banned, it was already a strong contender. And now without another one of the strong contenders, there's like this power vacuum. And I think that it is natural for people to head there. And that matchup is not as bad as it would seem. I think a lot of people make it out to be this horrible matchup for Shadow. But in reality, I think it is closer to 45-ish%. But you have to respect it. And that is what having 4 dress downs and 3 Toroks does. Because Torok is, frankly, pretty close to lights out against that matchup.
Yeah.
They have so few ways to interact with it once it's in play, and it hits them for 2 cards. It's kind of just everything I want in that matchup.
Yeah, I think that's one of those cards that's just really, really good in a few really select matchups that are really important to shore up for all of these kind of, it's really good when you play Rakdos or Jund, you need access to that card against that matchup. Same thing here. I kind of feel like Torok is one of those cards that's just a little bit underappreciated still at this point as a piece of tech against a lot of decks that are really good.
Yeah, so part of the reason that these Solitude decks are so good is because they can be incredibly mana efficient with the pitch costing of Solitude and Fury. They can play a spell and evoke one of the elementals in the same turn, but that often puts them down on cards. So once they're down on cards from doing things like evoking Solitude or Fury, and you then Hymn to Torok them, they're often left with very little.
Right. And then you're kind of like, let's go.
Yeah, you have a 4/3 that they can't kill outside of the Fury or maybe the Errant Lightning Bolt. And even then you have Dress Down to stop a Fury.
Right. So we talked about this a little bit last week, and I shouldn't have been surprised by this, but I was not surprised, but it just Dress Down being good enough to be around without Lurrus was a little bit of a like, wow, that card just is very, very good. And it was very under the radar on that Modern Horizons 2 spoiler when that list came out. I just think that that card has been a kind of a fundamental change to a bunch of different decks too. And I even saw it in those legacy lists, which was fascinating as well, that people are starting to find space for it in that format as well.
Yeah, I think that Dress Down is likely a top 10 card from Modern Horizons 2, but I think you're right. When that spoiler came out, nobody was talking about that card almost at all.
Yeah, the only reason we talked about the card when we did the spoiler was we were like, this is a permanent that says draw a card on it, and it's cheap. And we were like, that's almost enough to really keep your eyes on it just for that reason, and then we'll see where it goes.
Michael, do you recall when Dress Down became a shadow card?
Honestly, I think Aspiring Spike was the first person that I saw to discover that card and put it in Shadow. So kudos to him or wherever he saw the idea. I don't know, if it was something suggested by a reviewer or if he came up with it organically. So whoever figured that out was, really onto something.
And likewise, then, do you think that Dress Down is so critical now as both an offensive and defensive tool against like Constructs and Pitch Elementals, countless other cards, right? Do you think it's so critical now that any version of Blue Shadow is likely going to run that over Battle Rage? Like, is that just kind of an easy upgrade, contemporary modern?
Yeah, I think so. At least in the course of the current modern landscape, I think the answer is yes. If you go back to 2019, 2018 or whatever, you saw decks like Humans and various other decks that had 25 or 30 creatures in them, and getting your Shadow through in those matchups was hard. So you actually did need Team or Battle Rage to finish a lot of games to get through blockers because you just couldn't kill enough things. That's not true anymore. You see decks with 12, 14, 16 creatures now, and like that's a lot of creatures.
Yeah.
So it's
because everybody's got to fit 4 Expressive Iteration and 4 Prismatic Endings.
Yeah, exactly.
3 March of Otherworldly Lights in all their decks now.
Yeah, so now it's like very easy to clear the board with removal spells to be able to attack for damage, that you don't need a card that is just there to deal damage anymore. Similarly, I think that Dress Down does a pretty close Team or Battle Rage impression when your opponent's not blocking.
Mm-hmm.
So the utility of it, honestly, I keep playing with the card and I keep finding new things that it does, which is just not something that you could ever do with Battle Rage. And it's never dead, right? Like you said, it's a cheap permanent that draws a card. It also helps turn on Delirium for Unholy Heat and Dragon's Rage Channeler.
Mm-hmm.
It kills Constructs, like you said. It just does so much that Battle Rage could never do.
It shuts off Magus of the Moon, which is becoming a little bit more popular now too.
Yep. It just does so much that I think going forward, if Modern continues to look remotely the same, that these Blue Shadow decks will not only have 3 to 4 copies, but it is one of the primary reasons to be blue in your Shadow decks.
Yeah, it's that and Expressive Iteration, right? And Drown. I guess, are the main thing. So the blue pips start to add up pretty quick. Once you put one in, it's like, oh, and then we get to play this card, and then we're going to play this card. But that was one of the biggest bummers from when I used to play Grixis Death Shadow a lot with Temur Battle Rage, was like drawing it at the wrong time. It's like, I can't do anything with this card. It's dead right now. I have to wait for the right time to use it. You and I talked previously about how almost having Battle Rage in your deck, it was a more important threat than sometimes actually having it in your hand. Like you sort of had to represent that you had it to people to be able, so that they respect not taking damage off of a shadow really easily. And this is just a whole different thing now, where you can use it offensively, you can use it defensively. It's got more utility. I will say it's a lot harder card to play than that plan was. And I think a lot of, in some aspects, I think that this version of Death Shadow is pretty difficult to play because of all the optionality that you had. Like you said at the beginning of when we started talking about this, there's a lot of agency with this shadow list and most shadow lists. And that's only increased over time as we have cards with powerful modes more often, cards that have different edge cases and understanding the rules to be able to make them good. And that's all good for the deck. But I do think it's made it more complex to be a pilot of the deck for sure.
Yeah, it kind of cuts both ways, to be honest. I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago, especially with Lurrus. I think that the Shadow deck was very hard to play perfectly, because Lurrus in specific gave you so many options every game. And that's something that I've had a lot of people approach me with in Discord or whatever. They'll be like, I can't seem to win with this Shadow deck, but I played the old Shadow deck for a long time. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. But there's so many more moving pieces. Lurrus, Ragavan, all the Surveils from Dragon's Rage Channeler, Dress Down, all add so many different decision points to the game, which is something I love. But it's interesting because it also seems easier sometimes because your cards are just better.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like, part of the reason that the old Shadow decks were seen as hard to play is because a bunch of your cards were just bad.
Right.
You had cards like Thought Scour in your deck.
Yeah, and it's like, what if I have an opening 7 that's Bauble, Thought Scour, and Street Wraith? Like, am I keeping all these cantrips? Do I actually want to do this? Or like, what if I have no action and all cantrips? Like, what am I doing here? So that, yeah, as you get that air out of there somewhat, you have more cards that do things. And so I guess it does feel like you're more prepared for a plan.
Yeah. And I think even now, there's hands that I draw where I'm just like, I have Ragavan, Thoughtseize, Bauble, other cards, and I have to sit there and think about whether I want to play Ragavan or Thoughtseize on one.
This is a question we've talked about on here before too. Stan, go ahead.
Game 1, you're on the play in the blind. What do you do? Like, I'm inclined to think you go with Ragavan just because that's the most snowbally card. It's a must-answer threat. You're going to trade 1 for 1 anyway if they can remove it. Do you have any kind of heuristics? You can even throw DRC into that mix because that kind of can change the calculus as well.
One thing that I do like about companions is they give off a lot of what your opponent is doing.
Right.
So that's always my question when somebody says, do you keep this hand in game 1 in the dark, is, did they show me a companion?
Yeah.
Because there are companions like Kahira, for example. I am more than happy to lead off on Ragavan because I know that they can't kill Ragavan reliably on turn 1, and it will start to run away with the game in those matchups. But if my opponent showed me Lurrus, for example, I would often play my discard spell on 1 unless I had 2 Ragavans. Similarly, I think that hands with like 2 discard spells and a Dragon's Rage Channeler, I'll often lead on discard spell and then go Dragon's Rage Channeler second discard spell. Because especially if my Dragon Rage Channeler is my only creature, like, it is important to protect that.
So closing out on the stock list here, you said that you still like this list a lot after Indianapolis. What are you thinking about after what you just kind of played against in Modern? What you might do to tweak this list, or are you thinking about just taking this one back out pretty much the way that it is right now?
So the deck as a whole felt powerful. It felt cohesive. Like, I was doing the things that I wanted to do. My matchups could have been better, for sure. I think that, so against the Solitude Teferi decks, which I played 10 rounds of, I went 6-4, which I think is probably
pretty good for Shadow.
Yeah, slightly above expectation in those matchups in a normal tournament. If you told me I could be 60% in those matchups over a normal tournament, I would take it. Because then if you start to run hot, then you're maybe 70% in those matchups and you go, 2-1 against them or whatever. And then you're in a pretty good position if you're doing well against your other matchups. However, 60% in those matchups, when they're the only thing you play, is a little less good.
Right.
But yeah, I have some things coming down the pipeline that I want to work on. I've been toying around with the idea of like 1 or 2 main deck spell pierces to try to help with the white decks and the increase that I expect to see in Cascade decks. I think that Agadeem's Awakening is an interesting angle to maybe go back to now that we don't have Lurrus, which is just something that you didn't need when you had Lurrus. So that's something I want to check out. Maybe some main deck Torox.
Why Awakening? Yeah. Like, why not just run an Earth? I feel like when all of your threats are basically 1 mana, is it just for the chance to get back a Kroxa and a 1-drop, or something else going on there?
It's easier to fit. So Unearth is generally more powerful in a vacuum because it is cheap. 1 point in Agadeem's Awakening is that it is also a land.
That fuels your shadow.
Yeah, so you can kind of fit it into the deck a little easier because you can just cut another one of your lands for it. But yeah, I think Unearth is going to accomplish a similar goal in a lot of different cases.
All right. Why don't we go on and talk about Murktide and kind of where your thoughts were there? Because some people have had some success with it. In particular, Ari Zax won a modern Super PTQ on March 13th with a list that was pretty close to the list that you had posted in your article. And that just has Murktide in it. What do you think is going on with this deck? Why have you kind of felt like maybe this isn't the one that you like as much? The main difference here is there's 4 Murktides, of course, and then generally there's 3 to 4 considers in these lists. And in exchange, they still don't have any street wraiths. They tend to not be able to fit things like Dress Down in the main deck in favor of Murktides and other cantrips instead.
So I think Murktide lets you be more aggressive because Murktide is large and hard to answer and evasive. So the downside is that it asks a lot of your mana being blue-blue.
Can't play Gigantha for one thing.
Yeah. Honestly, Murktide is one of the cards that I'd be willing to give up Gigantha for if I could find a way to make it work the way I want it to. But it just feels so much less fluid when you have to... Because the Shadow decks really want to get Blood Crypt on turn 1 basically every game. So having Blood Crypt on turn 1 doesn't let you cast Murktide on 2 lands, and you spend a surprising amount of games on 2 to 3 lands. So it can be tricky to cast Murktide and all of your other spells efficiently. One of the reasons that I ended up moving Street Wraith out of these decks when I was testing them is you look at it and you go, oh, it's a free spell, it goes to the graveyard, it helps delve. But unlike Gurmag Angler, Murktide cares about what you delve. So having a Street Wraith in the graveyard often doesn't mean a ton for the purposes of Murktide. So it just ended up, you couldn't get enough of the instants and sorceries into the deck that you wanted to get into the deck if you use those spots on Street Wraith.
It seems to me like it's a point toward Unholy Heat DRC, though, where in some of these decks, when you're threat light, it can be hard to get a creature in the yard. But I guess Murktide would be more important, though. Like, if that's kind of the main concession you're building your deck around, you want to make sure your Murktide's as big as possible versus just activating Delirium.
Yeah, and there's kind of a balance that goes into that, because that was one of my initial points to playing Street Wraith, is it helps turn those cards on, and Dragon's Rage Channeler helps turn on your Murktides, and there's like an interesting balance going on there, because obviously you don't want your Dragon's Rage Channelers to be 1/1s all the time, just to help fuel the Murktides, because then you're kind of wasting those spots too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it just, Murktide also made it so it was tricky to play main deck Dress Downs, and I think without main deck Dress Downs, Murktide Regent in specific is like very vulnerable to Solitude, which, you know, as we talked about before, isn't the end-all be-all, but if you're playing a card like Murktide Regent, which asks you to do a lot to make it good, having it solituded is kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I think one thing that strikes me about these lists, too, when you talk about Dress Down not being able to get in main, you also aren't able to fit in a value engine like Kaido or something like that in the list that have Murktide. It feels to me like, in a weird way, this version is, like you said, it's more aggressive, but it's also kind of like a strangely more linear plan for a deck that's like this, where you maybe don't have as much play as you are used to with kind of your utility pieces that you have space for in the more stock list. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you lose a lot of those utility cards in favor of playing like Consider, which isn't a card that we would be interested in playing normally, but you kind of have to if you want to try to make Murktide good. So you lose a little bit of longevity for a little bit of aggressiveness, but also your deck just has some air in it because you have Considers and similar cards.
What do you think it would take for this deck? Do you think it's meta dependent that this deck, like how you would favor one deck versus the other? Or do you think that you're probably going to stick with closer to something to stock for a while and not look back at Murktide anytime soon?
I think it would take a lot for Murktide to be better than the version that I'm playing, because it is worse against Hammer and worse against 4-color. And those are two of the matchups that I really want to be ready for. That being said, it's probably better against Murktide, and it is, probably a little bit better in like the Shadow Mirrors. But those aren't the places that I think the Shadow decks need help right now.
Stan, you played this deck some this week, right? What did you think you were think about it?
Mike, for background, I actually have a fair amount of experience playing just Izzet Murktide. And
Yep.
I was excited to see the Shadow version of that deck, essentially. And it was really hard for me to kind of just adjust my brain to playing with hand disruption spells where I'm used to playing counter magic, because I think that's basically the primary trade-off that's happening here. And as a result, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm just not as practiced in Shadow as I think it takes to pick up a new version of the deck and find your role in matchups and pilot it with some proficiency. I did feel, though, that if Murktide Shadow continues to be a thing, that is another point of tension that can make piloting it actually kind of hard, where, you want your hand disruption to clear the way for your cheap threats. You want things like Thoughtseizes to make your shadows a little bigger, and they do help fuel the Murktide too, but the blue and Murktide, I think, contributes really nicely to being able to play a counterspell or even an Archmage's Charm. And I don't know, that just felt like trying to stick a peg into the wrong hole, and maybe it doesn't have to be a 3-color deck at the end of the day. Like, maybe it can be just some kind of version of blue-black Murktide Shadow even, or some other iteration that makes room for dress downs too.
Yeah, and I have certainly seen the blue-black versions going around. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I was trying to fit as much testing in as I possibly could before Indy. So between the Lurrus Ban and Indy, I had roughly 2 weeks.
Right.
So,
I mean, you killed those PTQs, though. I mean, I know you didn't top 8 either one, but you came in, 9th and 10th in those 2 different PTQs that you took Shadow to in the weekend in between. That's super impressive, too.
The 9th place one was actually a sealed PTQ.
Okay.
The 10th place one was Shadow, and I ended up missing on tiebreakers. But that was, honestly, that was a deck that me and Zach ended up building at like 1:30 in the morning the day of the PTQ or something, after playing like 12 rounds of sealed.
Wow.
So
you're like we're putting Kaido in. Let's just do it 12:30 in the morning. You could be honest if that's where it came from.
Well, I mean, we were like I was like really debating between the Royal Scions and Kaido, and he was like, honestly, what the Royal Scions does. You've played it before. We don't know what Kaido does. We should just try it. And I was like, 10-round PTQ on Moto maybe isn't the best place to do it, but it's where I'm going to do it.
Yeah, it's where you can do it. I think someone who has the amount of reps in that you do can handle that kind of stuff for sure.
But yeah, that's honestly where Kaido came from. We were kind of just throwing stuff at the wall to see what worked out. And it just so happened that Kaido was pretty good that day, and also pretty good last weekend, and continues to be good in those grindy matchups where we want those extra resources, which are, as I previously touched on, where Shadow needs the help. It doesn't need help at the bottom against, low to the ground aggressive decks or, other tempo decks, because it's already, the core of the deck is already so good against those strategies that realistically it just needs help against the bigger decks.
Makes a ton of sense. All right, so why don't we move on to let's talk about Ranger Captain of Eos and Mardu Shadow for a quick minute, but talk a little bit about kind of the other flavors of Shadow that have floated around in the past really quickly, and just kind of maybe why they're not gelling as much right now. But let's start with Mardu. So the big thing that Ranger Captain of Eos does, of course, is that it provides you some resilience against, it gives you a threat, so it gives you a card of value, essentially. It lets you search up a shadow, or if you want to get Dragon's Rage Channeler or a Ragavan off of your Ranger Captain, you can do that as well. And then, of course, it has a sacrifice trigger that's good against spells decks. That, I think, is a good synergy, of course, between a deck full of one drops. You put together a list, Everett, we were talking about Inspiring Spike this deck a few times the last few weeks, that he had a 5-0 with a Mardu list as well, an Obosh Mardu list. What were your thoughts about this deck that I think a lot of us had fun with, 2-3 years ago in the Hex Parasite era as well?
Yeah, so the reason that I looked at Mardu originally and Ranger Captain originally is now you have good non-shadow 1-drops to get. You can get Dragon's Rage Channeler and you can get Ragavan. You're not just stuck getting Hex Parasite when you don't want to get a Death Shadow, or when you can't play a Death Shadow. So Ranger Captain does get better in that regard. Ranger Captain also very, very good against the Cascade decks.
Yeah.
Yikes.
It's kind of like a giant stop sign.
Yeah. It's like, all right, cast your Violent Outburst. Go ahead. And a lot of those decks, frankly, aren't very good at killing a 3/3. So I do think Ranger Captain is good in those regards. But specifically the version that I played when I built Mardu Shadow didn't have Obosh because I thought the 2-mana spells were just too important to give up. Mainly being Torok and Terminate and Cruxa. And Terminate's kind of a weird one, but I think you need it to have any sort of a respectable Murktide matchup because the white removal isn't doing you any favors there.
Mm-hmm.
And similar to the point I was touching on earlier with Torok against the Solitude decks, I think you kind of need to have Torok in your Shadow decks at the moment to be able to hang with those decks too. So giving up those cards, and Crocs is good in the Black Mirrors, anyone that's trying to grind without Solitude. So giving up all those cards for Obosh just didn't seem worth it to me.
Yeah, especially when it doesn't come up super often. The Mardu list, your Mardu list has one more land, but it's still 19 lands. So it takes work. Even when you draw a lot of cards or something like that, it takes work to get up to 5 lands to be able to cast Obosh. So I can understand that for sure.
Yeah. Ultimately, it just didn't feel as strong as Grixis. It didn't feel as smooth. And I think by and large, that is not having expressive iteration and not having dress down to help protect things, which are, like I said, the two primary reasons to play blue in your Shadow decks right now. So missing those components when you're trying to play Mardu instead, the white cards just didn't end up being better than the blue cards.
Why were you running Street Wraith here when you cut it elsewhere?
So I think that going forward, I would look at cutting Street Wraith in that deck. It made the initial versions as kind of a way to make Shadow better because you didn't have good ways to go long per se.
Mm-hmm.
So that was we can try to go fast by playing Street Wraith to make our Shadows better because we have higher access to Shadow because of Ranger Captain. And additionally, you don't have the card advantage abilities of Dress Down and Expressive Iteration to help turn on Delirium or find the cards to turn on Delirium. So having an extra creature helps in those regards.
And then, you talked about a little bit earlier. So Jund Shadow used to be a favorite of a lot of people. Definitely that super aggro version. We're not even looking at that right now, mostly because the biggest you mentioned it earlier, but you think the main payoff of even playing a Jund version like that is become Immense plus Temur Battle Rage, and it's too risky right now. Is that the thinking?
Yeah, and it's that is one of the things. And it's too risky for a lot of reasons. Solitude being a big one, which is a recurring theme. But I think having a solid plan against Solitude right now is very important. But similar to what we were talking about earlier, Unholy Heat just kind of does a lot of work against the cards that you'd be putting in that deck. So investing something like a Become Immense and a Temur Battle Rage into a combat step, and then having your creature killed by March of the Otherworldly Light or Unholy Heat is very dangerous without good ways to protect it.
Yeah, and certainly that diminishes even another thing that deck used to be really good about was having that consistent 2-mana threat that was on another axis in Tarmogoyf, right? And it's sort of like maybe we're not really at a loss for threats right now. We could go with Murktide if we really wanted to. We can go with, just with the deck like the Grixis ones that only has 12 creatures in it, and that's fine because Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ragavan do so much work on their own that maybe it's not even worth splashing into that 2-mana zone. So some of the things that made that deck good before just maybe don't really exist as far as meta conditions go right now.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of people in the last 2 weeks approach me about playing like a Jund Traverse build, and I don't think Traverse, the Shadow decks just don't need Traverse anymore. Like they just have enough good threats to play thanks to the red 1-drops that you just don't need the consistency that Traverse brings up at the cost of, a slot in your deck that has a real fail case sometimes when you can't get Delirium. That card's just not very good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's terrible.
So having that risk for to try to fix a problem that you just don't really have anymore isn't needed. But the other version of the deck the other version of Jund that I was looking at was the 6 to 8 2-drops version with Tarmogoyf and Scourge of the Skyclaves.
Mm-hmm.
But Scourge also is pretty bad into Solitude.
Yeah, even worse.
Yeah,
in some ways. R.I.P. I loved that deck for the minute that it was good. The 8 Shadow deck with that and regular Shadow.
Oh
for
yeah,
sure.
there's few better feelings than killing somebody from 15 with Scourge plus TBR.
Yeah, that was the most insane timing. The way all that stuff worked out was so wild. But R.I.P. Scourge. Maybe we see you someday in the future.
Yeah, hopefully Wizards will lay off the Solitude-like cards for a little bit. When Modern Horizons 2 is getting spoiled, my buddy was just like, "Oh, you just have to dodge Swords to Plowshares and you'll be good." And then they spoiled Solitude, and I'm like, "It's somehow worse."
Yeah. It's 1 mana, or it's 0 mana.
I have to imagine it's not just Alto too, but Dress Downs seem pretty bad against that, right?
Yeah, Dress Down just kills Scourge. It makes Tarmogoyf an 0/1. There's a lot of stuff going around that kind of makes the 2-drops kind of sketchy.
Which is sad. I know there's a lot of people who are fans of that deck, but when you really look at it and analyze the different pieces like you guys are talking about, I think it becomes clear why that's not a great option at the moment.
Yeah, and it's something that I revisit every time there's a shift just to see. But it hasn't. I don't think it's been right in some time. Which, unfortunate. I kind of like that deck too, but we got to kill your darling sometimes.
Yeah, but what we should really bring back is Oko. Do the 4-color Oko Shadow. Why is no one talking about Oko anymore?
Honestly, I think I beat more Okos than I ever did Uros.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a crazy sentence. But it kind of goes to show you how good Oko is when Death Shadow is putting Oko in their deck.
Yeah, I remember talking about that at the time and being like, Death Shadow wasn't even a good Oko deck, but you had to do it at the time. It's the only deck that I ever played. Got a chance to play Oko in before it was banned on that tiny window.
Yeah, you put the Food Factory in your deck that wants to hurt itself, and you're just like, this looks weird, but Oko's too messed up to not play.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking us through all your thoughts here. Again, everybody check out Michael's articles on Card Kingdom's blog and follow him on Twitter at Rapacious1 on Twitter if you don't know how to find him. Did you have anything else you wanted to let people know that you're up to these days, Michael?
So most of my work is on Twitter. Very briefly, I believe in a very public testing process. So all of my iterations of the deck that I'm considering playing, what I end up playing, all usually ends up on my Twitter. But another place you can find it is in my Discord. I run a pretty shadow-focused Discord. We talk about Modern as a whole as well, but there's a pretty heavy focus on Shadow. So if you're not in there, we can leave a link to it in the show notes or something.
Yep, gladly, we'll add it.
And yeah, everything's free. All my work gets posted in there. There's a community that's getting larger by the day of people that are all trying to figure out Shadow, and everyone's talking about different variants. There's always somebody talking about Jund or Mardu or Blue Black or Grixis or whatever have you. So it is often where I point people if they want to get my perspective and other people's perspectives on the deck.
Are you planning to go to Dallas, or do you have any other paper tournaments on your horizon where someone might even get to meet you?
I'm considering going to Dallas. I'm not sure yet. I know I'll be in Pittsburgh for the team sealed one.
Great format, team sealed.
Yeah, I do like it. That is the only large tournament that I have left on the horizon until SCG or some other tournament organizer announces more stuff, because they tend to do these things in batches, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see how that goes. I'm certainly always looking to travel for Magic tournaments whenever I can. So if you ever see me at something, feel free to come up and say hello. I know I had a couple people in Indy do it. Always happy to talk.
Well, thank you so much for your time again, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Certainly happy to be back whenever you have me.
Can't wait to take you up on that. But until then, that does wrap up this week's show. If this is your first time listening to the Dive Down, and maybe you just haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to our podcast or just reach out in general, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. You can also support the show via Patreon. Find us over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring The Dive Down. If you sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown2022, all one word, you'll get 15% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. You can also use the promo code TheDiveDown2022 over at Barrister and Mann and get 15% off your first order. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and cast more Shadow!